Serena Williams is one of the biggest names in tennis, with 7 Wimbledon titles under her belt and 23 Grand Slam titles. However, she's about to retire after the 2022 US Open. Serena says she wants to spend more time with her family, her husband and daughter. She will be living on a high, especially in terms of earnings. Her 27-year career has earned her $450 million. Her retirement has raised discussions on sportsmanship and mental health, especially in Africa. Let's bring in sports psychologist Professor Leon Van Niekerk from the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Fort Hare, East London, South Africa. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Van Niekerk. So, the story of Serena and her sister Venus Williams is not one of privilege. Her success was initially nurtured at an old public tennis court in her neighborhood. Now, in the African context, there isn't much investment in public sports facilities and programs targeting girls especially. How important is this?
Hi, hello, Penny. No, it is so important to invest in facilities. I mean, we hear these stories of athletes who overcome many challenges and difficulties just to have access to some facility somewhere that make it in life. But in general, the facilities, especially in rural areas in South Africa, is very, very limited. And some of our research is indicating that quite a number of students are so highly motivated to participate in sport, but due to the lack of facilities or coaching or resources that can make it possible for them, they just give up. And because of that, we are missing out on a talent pool that we could have identified that can lift up our sport and make and open opportunities and make possibilities for our athletes, especially for girl children in our environments, to become superstars. Even if they just participate on provincial or national level, it's very, very difficult for these athletes because there is so limited facilities around. I mean, those facilities might even be in situations where it's not safe for that athlete to participate, go for training. Opportunities are limited, and our policies at some of these federations and some of the municipalities and sport presenters are quite good. However, the implementation of that is often lacking, so that our athletes just give up and go do something else and then miss out on opportunities to have an athletic career.
Now, sexism and racism, accompanied by intense public scrutiny in competitive sports, have drawn attention to the critical question of mental health in sports. What opportunities are there for Africans to deal with mental health in sports, and how big a problem is it?
Yeah, it's quite a big problem, especially with mental health. You know, many of our athletes, even those participating at provincial level, might not even have access to a medical doctor. Sometimes just a physiotherapist somewhere, if they are lucky enough. So they have to fend for themselves in many of these environments where there is such a lack of access to mental health facilities. I mean, even in general, the population is struggling with that because primary mental health care now is access to primary health care facilities. They have to go to a clinic. There's not a special approach now to open possibilities for care for mental health in general for the population in South Africa. If it is for athletes, they also have to deal with the pressure that comes from sexism and racism and public scrutiny in this regard that is sometimes brutal for our athletes to deal with on a mental health level. So depression and anxiety and those kind of mental health problems is alive and kicking sometimes for our athletes. Sometimes also the whole idea of stigmatization that they have to deal with, where many teammates or even parents or community members might think if you have a mental health problem, it is a weakness that you have, is contributing to many of these athletes suffering in silence, having to deal with their mental health issues on their own without assistance. Some of our students who are playing in the national cricket and the national rugby teams and other sports here at our university has access to student counseling services at least. But in general, those services are so limited and so far in between that athletes avoid going to them, avoid accessing them, and sometimes suffer in silence because of that.
Right, and I think even if they were there, those facilities, accessibility is also another issue. I mean, just looking at Serena, for instance, she lives accompanied by a financial exit strategy, Serena Ventures, that have been built for decades. It's not the same, though, here in Africa, where financial advice is lacking. And some of these athletes have become victims of family issues, extortion, and rogue agents. So what kind of support should governments put in place for athletes, and even more so women athletes?
Yeah, you know, there is some support with some of the federations and some of the sport clubs that provide workshops and will invite financial advisors and those kind of services to speak to their developmental teams, or maybe their professional teams, or those who are on provincial or even national level. And they make these kind of facilities available. But beyond that, there is not much for our athletes. I mean, we know the stories of some of our athletes, especially some of our national boxers who were international world champions, who towards the end of their life didn't even have money to be on a medical aid because of the mismanagement of their funds and the weak guidance that they sometimes get to invest their money and take care of their money properly. Only if you can afford it, or if you are a professional athlete, you might have some resources to contribute to your mental health and taking care of your mental health. But beyond that, there is not much. If SASCOC doesn't come to the table, or federations don't provide those kind of services, nothing else is available. And sometimes some of these service providers will abuse our athletes in this regard, leaving them in a situation that they are worse off than that they started with them. So yeah, the exploitation of our athletes, you mentioned families as well, who look at those opportunities that their children have to earn money from sport as a way to provide for them as well. And sometimes these athletes have to take care of family members and others, which make it a really difficult context to deal with. And if they don't have access to good advice in this regard, they might be exploited. They might find it very difficult to have access to some of these financial institutions that can provide them with good and sound advice, because the athlete's lifespan is very short. If they don't make their money within their 20s, maybe 30, 31, they can push it if they are lucky. They will have no other money after that if they don't have an alternative job or an alternative position to fall back on. So yeah, the pressure for them to make a living of this is sometimes quite daunting and difficult for them to overcome.